Committee Substitute for House Bill 4187, Business Liability Protection Act.
Are there amendments?
Delegate Schott and Byrd move to amend the bill. This is HFA Schott and Byrd 2-26, number 1.
The gentleman from 27th, Delegate Schott, asks unanimous consent to explain the amendment in lieu of having it read. Is there objection? Chair hears none. Gentleman from 27th.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill is what's titled the Business Liability Protection Act. It's often referred to as the parking lot bill. It basically provides that employers cannot restrict their parking areas from individuals who want to bring their firearms in their vehicle and leave them in the parking lot while they are working. There are certain requirements in order to do that. It's got to be secured in some fashion, either in a locked vehicle or in a locked glove box and so forth. The bill is very broad and does not carve out any exceptions for any type of employer. So what this amendment is, it basically carves out a very limited exception designed for safety, and it basically there are certain conditions. First of all, the person that would be the company that would be protected by this is an owner or lessor or lessee of a chemical manufacturer or an oil and gas refiner on which the primary business conducted is the manufacture, use, storage, or transportation of hazardous, combustible, or explosive materials. Further, there are additional conditions that have to be met in order to be accepted from that general prohibition. First of all, the parking area has to contain the physical plant. It has to be not open to the public. It has to be secured by a fence or other barrier, and the access has to be restricted through the use of a gate, security station, or other means which is constantly monitored by security personnel. And finally, the employer has to provide alternative parking reasonably close to the primary parking area at no additional cost to the employee, to those employees who transport or store firearms in their vehicles. Now, this provision was in the committee substitute that the Judiciary Committee considered. It was amended out. So the purpose of this amendment is to add it back in. The reason it was in there in the first place was because it was requested by the Manufacturers Association for security and protection purposes, where they have primarily these large storage tanks where all different types of chemicals are stored, or explosive or incendiary type chemicals such as oil, natural gas, and so forth. The Manufacturers Association suggested that we look at the language that Texas had used in the similar statute, and so we did, and in fact we pulled that language almost verbatim from the Texas statute. It's not quite as restrictive as our statute, and I can read to you what is required in Texas. The exception is property owned or leased by a chemical manufacturer or oil and gas refiner. So that language tracks the language in our bill, or in this amendment, and on which the primary business conducted is the manufacture, use, storage, or transportation of hazardous, combustible, or explosive materials. So that language also tracks the language in this amendment. It goes on to say that the parking lot, garage, or other parking area is outside of the security, that the employer has to provide alternative parking outside of the secured and restricted area that contains the physical plant that's not open to the public, and which ingress is constantly monitored by security personnel. In other words, what we've done is we've taken the language in Texas, which I think most of us would agree is not a liberal paragon. It is a gun rights state, very conservative. We've taken that language and put it in here for public safety purposes to avoid an accidental discharge that could create a major problem. I note, just by way of reference, that on the NRA website, if you go to the NRA website, they note when this bill was passed, they state NRA-backed Senate Bill 321 takes effect this Thursday, September 1st, and that was 2011. So at that time, this bill was backed by the NRA with that provision in it. We also checked other states particularly those that we're in competition with to expand our natural gas industry, and specifically the chemical byproducts of the natural gas extraction, the ethanes, propanes, all of those type of that come out of the wet gas. Looked at Louisiana, for instance, which is a state that's where a lot of this natural gas now goes for processing. Louisiana has a similar parking lot statute, but it also has an exception. And it reads as follows: any vehicle on property controlled by a public or private employer or business entity, if access is restricted or limited through the use of a fence, gate, security station, signage, or other means of restricting or limiting general public access onto the parking area, and if one of the following conditions applies: either the employer or business entity provides facilities for the temporary storage of unloaded firearms, or if the employer provides an alternative parking area reasonably close to the main parking area in which employees and other persons may transport or store firearms and lock privately owned motor vehicles. I note in that statute it's not limited to chemical or oil and gas manufacturers. In other words, in Louisiana, any type of business entity can can take advantage of this type of exception, as long as they have this type of secured area and provide either alternative parking or storage. Similarly, Mississippi, which is another state where these natural gases and the byproducts are transported, they have a similar statute. It reads as follows: a private employer may prohibit an employee from transporting or storing a firearm in a vehicle in a parking lot or other parking area the employer provides for employees to which access is restricted or limited through the use of a gate, security station, or other means of restricting or limiting general public access on the property. Once again, in that situation, any employer can qualify for that as long as they have that secure area, which is to which access is limited from the public by a gate, security station, or other type of security means. We also looked at a number of other states, such as Arizona, Utah, North Dakota, all of which have exceptions, either unlimited as to the type of activity or which are basically limited to this type of hazardous type storage. So basically what we're trying to do here is maintain the intent of the bill, but at the same time provide some safety in certain very limited situations in two very limited industries. Mr. Speaker, I urge adoption of this amendment.
Are there other members desiring to speak to the adoption of the amendment? The gentleman from 36, Delegate Rowe.
If the gentleman would yield for a couple of questions.
Gentleman yields.
I'm looking over the bill, and as I understand it, your amendment would put in an exception only for manufacturing and chemical process plants.
That's correct. That's what the Manufacturers Association requested. We looked at all the other states. This seems reasonable under the circumstances.
Now, does the bill as a whole apply to college campuses or schools?
Well, first of all, keep in mind it's parking lots. This bill covers only parking areas. It does not accept out secondary. It does not accept out university or college parking lots. There is a provision here dealing with high school and normal public schools that ties back into the provisions we've adopted in the past. If you'll recall, basically allowing somebody to pick up somebody if they happen to have a weapon in their car, as long as they're not a student.
But a student, or what about faculty? Would they be able to use the parking lot for their firearms?
I think that is possible under this bill, yes.
In other words, even from K through 12, there's no exception there. In other words, the same rule would apply that the employer may not bar firearms in the parking lot, in locked cars.
We cover K through 12 in another bill, and it's referred to, I think, by section in the language, but no, it doesn't apply to K through 12.
Oh, okay. But expressly in the bill, or there's an overriding statute elsewhere?
It refers to a different statute that governs that situation.
Okay. Now, on college campuses, are students able to lock their firearms in the cars in the parking lot? I was looking at the language and I couldn't tell.
There's no exception. If they fall in the language of the statute in terms of they're legally authorized to carry a weapon, then there would be no prohibition against that would accept that. And let me start over. Universities or colleges could not accept out of this the language of this statute. So if you are a licensed or otherwise legal to carry a firearm, you could lock it in your car, secure it under the provisions of this statute, and be protected under this statute in a parking lot.
Does it use the term students?
No.
The bill itself?
No.
All right. And in your amendment, there's no reference to
The
students
amendment is purely those two types of businesses.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Lady from the 50th, Longstreth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Judiciary Chair yield for a question?
Yes.
On your amendment, we're talking about manufacturing of chemicals or something explosive, that we would eliminate them from bringing their guns into the parking lot of those particular facilities. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, if they met all those requirements. They have to have the area that they want to protect to be enclosed, monitored by security personnel, and so forth, and not accessible to the public, and offer alternative parking at no expense to their employees.
Okay, they can offer alternative parking somewhere else. Is
They
that
have
what you're...
to in order to qualify for this exemption.
Okay, and the employer will not be responsible for having the guns in the parking lot, because the law will say that you can conceal, or you can put your gun in your car and lock it up, just like we do out here in front of the Capitol. They do in a school parking lot. I say that we must have passed that in 2016, but in a business like this with chemicals, we have a special parking spot, and the employer would know. I mean, they would not be responsible if something would happen out there in the parking lot. Is that correct?
In the alternative, if we're talking about the alternative parking area, which is subject to this statute, part of the reason for the title, Business Liability Protection Act, is that there's immunity for an employer who allows their employees to leave their weapons in their car, locked or otherwise secured. There's an immunity. So to answer your question, yes, they would be protected in that situation.
Okay, and in the entire
would be.
bill, all the employers would have immunity. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, thank you.
John from the 50th, Caputo. Gentleman yields.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not on judiciary, as you know, and I haven't been there for a long time, but it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that this provision was in the committee substitute as it came before the committee. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the committee stripped it out of the committee substitute.
That is correct.
And what you're attempting to do right now is put it back in.
Exactly.
Thank you, sir.
Are there other members desiring to speak to the adoption of the amendment before I recognize? Gentleman from 24, Doug Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, as the chairman stated, the language was amended out as the gentleman from the 50th just asked. As a supporter of the Second Amendment myself, I cannot stand for this amendment. So I'm going to ask the House to reject the gentleman's amendment, and I'm going to ask for the yeas and nays. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there other members desiring to speak to the adoption of the amendment? John from 37th, Delegate Pushkin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the chairman please yield?
Gentleman yields.
Yes.
Okay, I suppose the intent of the amendment is basically what it's a carve out for the oil and gas industry and for the chemical manufacturing, and that's the only type of manufacturing?
Yes. If you have these type of explosive or volatile chemicals, it's hazardous, combustible, or explosive materials. So it's not just anybody in that industry, it's where they keep these type of materials.
So if it was say it was a tank farm that didn't have combustible material, then they wouldn't be exempt from this law then, right?
Yes, it has to be manufacture, use, storage, or transportation of hazardous, combustible, or explosive materials.
Okay.
So if you kept Kool-Aid in a big tank, it wouldn't matter.
Okay.
It wouldn't protect them.
What about gas stations?
It talks about chemical manufacturer, oil and gas refiner, okay? So it'd be a refinery and not necessarily a retail station.
Okay, thank you.
John for 60th, Delegate Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know much about chemical plants or the tanks that maintain chemicals. I do know a little bit about small arms, though. And I will tell you that the average small arm that someone's going to carry for personal protection is not going to be able to fire a round that would pierce the tank that we're concerned about here. It's actually a very minimal risk. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry, you can't hear me? Thank you. It's a very minimal risk. As a matter of fact, it's minimal to the point of being negligible. And in my personal opinion, what we're talking about here is an infringement upon the Second Amendment that is not warranted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
John for 61st, Delegate Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chairman yield.
Gentleman yield. Gentleman yields.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You indicated that a separate parking lot, under this amendment, a second parking lot would be required at the employer's expense for those that have firearms in their vehicle. Is that correct?
I think I understood your question. There was some background noise, but if your question is, in order to qualify for this exemption, the employer has to provide alternative parking for anybody who wants to bring and store their weapon in a locked vehicle or otherwise secure.
Is it required of that alternative parking lot to be gated with a fence and a
No.
security guard?
It's not required.
So would you agree that that parking lot then would be a theft magnet? Wouldn't everyone that parked in that parking lot have a firearm in their car and everyone passing through would know that?
No, not necessarily. I'm sure there's some folks here that don't carry a firearm in their car. So if they worked at that facility, they would, they could park in either place.
And you think they would park in that alternative parking lot even though they didn't have a firearm, even though their car would be protected in the parking lot with a gate?
I think they would have that choice and could certainly do so. It may be that the portion of the facility where they work is closer to that lot than the other portion.
Well, I think we just disagree on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr.
Sure.
Speaker.
Lady from the 50th. Lady from the 50th out of Longstreet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the appropriate time, may I speak to the bill or to the amendment?
Lady may proceed.
I don't think this is a bad amendment. I don't think it offends your Second Amendment rights. I believe in your Second Amendment rights. I never bring this up very often, but I am a veteran. I have shotguns. I have guns. It's not going to affect my Second Amendment rights just to be protective. I think we have to side on safety once in a while in this body, besides just saying that we can carry a gun. We're not eliminating that process. We're just trying to be a little bit more safe on an employer's ground where there could be something that could explode. I do support his amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
John from 63rd, Delegate Folk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the chair yield?
Gentleman yield.
Yes.
Gentleman yields.
So are we doing anything to restrict where cars without guns park on these facilities?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
Under this amendment, does it restrict where cars can park that don't have guns on them? In other words, can they be inside the gate close to the facilities that we're trying to protect that
Sure. Yes.
They are allowed to be there?
Yes.
Would you agree that terrorist attacks have happened in the past? They're perpetrated by somebody driving a vehicle?
Yes, sure.
Thank you. Reject the amendment.
Will the other members desiring to speak to the adoption of the amendment before I recognize the gentleman from 27th to close? Gentleman from the 22nd, Delegate Eldridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also rise to reject this amendment. We're not trusting our people that work for that company, for one. What if they want to go after hours and they live 2 hours away and they want to go hunting afterwards? Reject this.
John from 53rd, Delegate Jennings.
Would the chair yield, please?
Gentleman
Thank you,
yield.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
Yes.
Isn't the purpose of your amendment is for manufacturing? They are the ones that ask, and isn't the purpose of this body to get manufacturing in here? And by just appeasing some people, I know we're looking at different countries to come here to start manufacturing. Isn't this kind of a pet peeve to some of those countries?
Based on my knowledge, I would answer yes to all of the components of your question. Yes.
And the reason I feel that you have made a real attempt to secure everybody's Second Amendment of rights by they are still allowed to bring their guns. So if they want to go hunting right after work, their car's parked right outside the gated lot. They can get in and they can go hunting. But our purpose here is to entice manufacturing, and that I would go along with the amendment.
Thank you.
The gentleman from 25th, Doug Painter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Anybody that knows me knows I'm going to rise in opposition to this amendment. Anytime you muddy the waters on any gun law, you're unknowingly making more criminals and just making things more complicated. Reject this.
John from 60th, Doug Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My good friend from the 53rd asked, what was the purpose of our government here? Well, if we want to know the purpose of our government, we should check out the Constitution. It lays it out very clearly. Actually, in Article 1, Section 2, it says that it is the high and solemn duty of the several departments of government created by this Constitution to guard and protect the people of this state from all encroachments upon their rights. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Other members desiring to speak to the adoption of the amendment before I recognize the gentleman from the 27th to close debate. Gentleman from the 27th, Doug Schott, to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, there are two purposes to this bill. One is safety, and I will acknowledge that there's a minimal risk that some kind of discharge of a handgun or a shotgun or whatever type of typical weapon is carried, a firearm is carried in a vehicle, to cause any type of serious problem. I suspect that same argument would have been made before the Freedom Industries bill, that we have regulations in place that will prevent this type of thing from ever happening, containment enclosures and so forth. The fact is, in spite of all the regulations in place, in a state like West Virginia with limited resources that tries to regulate everything, we very rarely regulate anything totally effectively. I would suggest to you that if there is some type of accidental discharge or perhaps a intentional discharge among employees who get into an argument in an enclosed area where we have this type of volatile type of chemical, I would suggest to you that the consequences, even though the risk is minimal, could be catastrophic and perhaps even make Freedom Industry look as simple as a mosquito bite. But that's not the only purpose of this bill. This bill basically is intended to preserve our ability to grow an industry that may offer a path forward for us to get out of the financial difficulties we've had in the past, to provide us with the resources we need to address all the demands we have, the salaries of our public employees and so forth. This is the future for now and the base for growing a diversified economy. We know Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, all of those places we will be competing with for this industry to grow have similar legislation and have similar provisions that are actually not as restrictive as the one in this amendment. If we want to preserve the ability to attract those people here, we don't want a black mark against us going right off the bat. And these folks look at every factor, and West Virginia has a number of problems already that we have to overcome, but let's not add another problem to it. This provision was backed by the NRA when it was included in the Texas law. Why they've abandoned that position now, I have no idea, and I can only speculate. But I suggest to you, if it was valid then, it's valid now, and if we want to compete with Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, we need this type of language in our statute as well. And I urge you for both safety and competitive reasons to adopt this amendment.
Roll call has been demanded. Is demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Those in favor of the gentleman's amendment will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? Gentleman for the 15th. If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 22 ayes, 76 nays, 2 members absent, not voting. Less than the majority of members present having voted in the affirmative, I declare the amendment rejected. Are there further amendments?
Delegate Pushkin moves to amend the bill. This is HFA Pushkin 2-26, number 1.
John from 37th, Delegate Pushkin asks unanimous consent to explain the amendment in lieu of having it read. Is there objection? Chair hears none. John from 37th.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm make sure I have 2 amendments. I'll make sure this is the correct one. This would be, number 1. We just attempted to have a carve out in this bill for oil and gas and for certain chemical manufacturers. What this does is actually an exemption for spiritual assemblies, church or religious organizations. If that church or religious organization sincerely held religious beliefs, would keep them from allowing guns on their property. There are certain organizations like Jehovah's Witnesses, Quakers, that would be against their First Amendment rights to allow this on their property. So I know we all want to protect the Second Amendment. I believe this amendment protects the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment of the Constitution. I reserve the right to close, and I'm going to ask for the yeas and nays on this too.
With other members desiring to speak to the adoption of the amendment? The gentleman from 24th, Delegate Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to rise in rejection of this amendment. I will not go against the Southern West Virginia churches that believe in protecting themselves. I have a lot of church members down Southern West Virginia has expressed to me they don't want another Charleston, South Carolina. They want to protect themselves. Law enforcement is not always there on Sundays or on Wednesday nights. So I'm going to ask for the rejection and thank the gentleman for the yeas and nays.
John from 16th, Delegate Hornbuckle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to rise today in support of the gentleman's amendment. I don't think this is anything about forcing a church to do something. We just merely want to make sure it's an option, if they wish to control their church how they want to. And I would also say, to be consistent with the Pastor Protection Act, I will be voting yes for this. Thank you.
John from 36, Delegate Rowe.
Author of the amendment, yield.
Gentleman yield.
Question.
Gentleman yields.
Sure. Now, help me with this. As I understood my friend to the right, he's voting apparently against the amendment because he's afraid that it would prevent a church from being able to have the firearms in their parking lot. But does your amendment do that, or does it?
Absolutely not. This would not force them to allow it. But if a church voted to allow guns on their property, which I'm sure some do now, they'd be allowed to do that because that would be their right as well.
Well, then what does your amendment do? For churches that believe that they do not want on their property firearms.
Okay, what the amendment says is it would congregations, churches, spiritual assemblies that sincerely held religious beliefs would be against that. So it doesn't force a church to do anything it doesn't want to. Okay, it would just allow them to practice their First Amendment rights.
Thank you.
John from 22nd, Delegate Eldridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They can practice their First Amendment right. If they don't want to take a gun to church with them, they don't have to. But if they want to, we all allow them. So I'll be rejecting this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman for the 14th, Doug Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A question of the sponsor.
Gentleman yield.
Sure.
Gentleman yields.
Could this amendment prevent someone who wants to have a job working, say, as a janitor or something like that, or even cleaning snow off a parking lot? Could this prevent them from working at one of these religious institutions, I guess you might say?
Well, that would be up to the religious institution.
Okay, so
There's
the
nothing to
answer
say they
then is
couldn't.
yes, it could prevent them from having a job.
If they were working for, say, for a religious organization that didn't want guns on their property, yes, they could ask their employees not to bring guns on their property. That would be the church rules.
Okay. Speak to the bill. Mr. Speaker.
To the amendment, gentleman may proceed.
Or to the amendment. I would suggest that this amendment goes against the intent of the bill. The intent of the bill is to allow people who are employees of an organization to carry their weapons on the property. So I urge rejection of the amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman for 25th, Doug Painter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to rise in opposition to this one as well. I know the church I go to, there is a lot of guns in the parking lot already, and to knock them out of that, they would not be very happy about that.
Lady from 31st, Doug Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Gentleman yield? Gentleman yields.
Sure.
Okay, so let's say this church has a policy. Is there going to be a sign out front that specifically states for whatever religion that chooses to do that, or for their church to say no guns allowed in the parking lot?
That would be up to the church.
Okay, and so let's say that, I'm all about, like I've seen in West Virginia where many families, even in West Virginia, have given up human rights to take part in civil rights. And so I wouldn't want someone to give up their gun rights just for their religious rights. So I don't love pitting them apart. So what I'm asking you is, how do you plan on looking in the parking lot to know who has a gun and who doesn't? So if the policy says no, but say they do have it in their car, are you going to search their car every time they come to church?
No.
How would you know?
I wouldn't. I think what it would do is we'd go back to how the law is right now. And basically how the law is right now is that churches and places of business have that right now to make the rules on their own property. So that's what it would just allow churches to make the rules on their own property. How they want to enforce it, how they want to put up signage, that would be up to them. But basically how it is now is, if there's no sign, and then they asked somebody, hey, is there a gun in your car? Yeah, well, we asked you, next time you come, you don't have a gun in your car, we don't allow guns in our parking lot. That's how it would be now.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand, because still we have laws that prevent people from breaking into houses, but people still break into houses. So you're pitting someone's gun rights against their religious rights, and some people in that church may not agree with not being able to bring their gun on that parking lot. So you're still, you would have to have a consensus among the body of a church. And I've still yet to find a church where everybody believes exactly the same thing about every bit of their church from the top to the bottom of the rules. So I'm just trying to understand.
What's the question?
I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, I have a tendency to do this. So I guess really I just wanted to know what would be done to someone. Would they call the law on them? Would the amendment say that they would be able to prosecute that person for coming into the parking lot?
I think it would be the same thing that could happen right now. And it hasn't really been much of an issue. But it will be if we pass this law.
Thank you.
Jump from 62nd, Doug Overington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the sponsor continue to yield?
Gentleman yields.
To the sponsor. So what you would be doing is advertising or promoting you had a gun-free zone.
That would be up to the church. I wouldn't be advertising that. If they wanted to put up a sign, they could, and that would be their right.
But it would sort of be general knowledge that this church did not allow firearms in their parking lot, so that basically you would be letting, say, a deranged person know that this was a gun-free zone and what that meant.
I would say that a lot of people already know that certain congregations like Jehovah's Witnesses and Quakers currently don't allow guns on their property.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Lady from 51st, take a Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In our country, we don't tell churches what to do. We just don't do that. That is the First Amendment, and the Second Amendment does not take priority over everything else, especially when it's private property. The Second Amendment does not really apply to private property. It the government. It has to involve the government when it's the Second Amendment, and this is not the government. This is a private assembly. This is a group of people that are making the decision themselves, and this is out of line. I'm voting in favor of the amendment.
John from 36, Taggart Road.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly support the amendment. What this bill does is effectively say that the Second Amendment takes precedent over private property rights. And it's an interesting debate about that. But what this amendment does is to preserve the right, the freedom of religion, the freedom of a church to control what goes on its property. Without this amendment, we are saying that this bill applies to the private property of churches, and that we as a legislative body, as a secular body, can tell a religious group how to control their own property. This is an outrage, as this bill's written. An absolute outrage at taking private property rights. And then to extend that to churches, what are we thinking? Without this amendment, this bill literally overwhelms the right of religion in America, at least in West Virginia's part of America. This is a horror without this amendment. For many, it's a horror even with the amendment. I sometimes feel like I'm in a place where everything's upside down. This is upside down. People who believe in religion, who want to protect religion, are saying, no, not when it comes to the Second Amendment. Not when it comes to the Second Amendment. What we're going to do is tell you, even if you're a peace church, like Quakers and others, that you can't keep weapons off your parking lot. Now, for people who are concerned about it and say, yeah, but I want to go hunting after I go to my Quaker meeting. Okay, all you have to do is park somewhere else, for crying out loud. Park somewhere else. Show a little teeny respect for the religious belief of others. Mr. Speaker, I cannot more strongly support this amendment.
John from 32nd, Taggart Love.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I live in a little town called Oak Hill, and running through Oak Hill is what they call quarter L, runs all the way to Florida, to the Pennsylvania line or the Canadian line. One day my wife and I were sitting in there and we were talking to some folk, and someone said, do you realize how many hoodlums run on this interstate from north to south? They could stop by here any time and say, let's don't take out a Wendy's in Syracuse, New York. Let's do it at a little small town like Oak Hill. Now we go to Wendy's, my wife, she don't want to go to Wendy's no more. It scares her to death. She thinks somebody just might do that, stop by at that little Wendy's in Oak Hill with a whatever and knock out 8, 10, 15 people, including her. Well, speaking of the gentleman's amendment, I go to church on Sunday morning, and I'll be honest with you, if my preacher probably get him a proper permit and a couple of the deacons and maybe a choir member, I'd feel more secure sitting in that church, making sure that if someone came in that would come in one of these Wendy's, or like they have at these gun-free schools lately, or other places around the country, I guess I'd feel a little more secure knowing that somebody could take out that gentleman that is weak in the brain and needs some psychiatric treatment, So it's just something to think about. I just got that feeling about that, and I guess I could support the man's amendment on those bases. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
John from 60th, Doug Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As an ordained minister and a former staff member at various churches, I'd like to let you know that I'm not terribly verklempt about the idea of someone having a gun in my church, mainly because I usually have one in church. But anyway, here's the thing, all right? The bill does not infringe upon the religious right of the pastor or the leader of the organization or the leader of the congregation to say, you know, this is not the way we do things here. We don't carry guns in church. We don't have guns in our cars in the parking lot. I would really appreciate it if you wouldn't do that. See, the thing is that a religious leadership position is not a position of dictatorial leadership. You don't have a right to tell people what you will do. I understand there are a couple of places where that's happened, but that's not generally the way it's supposed to happen. It's supposed to be a position of moral authority where you lead by example. Now, if I want to teach my congregation that we don't carry guns in church, which, by the way, I would never do, I would do so by not carrying my gun and then explaining to them ad nauseum, ad infinitum, why we don't do that and why it's a bad idea. On the other hand, they do not have the right to prevent someone, or I, as a pastor, would not have the right to prevent someone from defending him or herself and their family, and perhaps me, in the case that it became necessary. So, yeah, in this particular situation, I would say that the right to defend yourself, the right to defend your family, the right to defend your friends to your right and left, trumps the idea that the church might dictate doctrine that takes away that particular right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
John from 37th, Doug Pushkin to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to clear up a few things just to make sure that we're absolutely positively clear on what this amendment does and what it doesn't do. It does not force churches or prohibit churches from allowing guns. If your church allows guns in the parking lot, it wouldn't affect them one bit. This is for those congregations and those denominations where it's a problem. And, you know, I believe in the First Amendment, we have an establishment clause that would prohibit us from laws that would prohibit the free exercise of religion. And I'm all for the Second Amendment, but I'm also for the First Amendment. And I think that's something we should think about if we're going to pass a law that really forces one's hand with what they do with their property. So I would say if you're concerned about, you know, the congregation that you go to that wouldn't allow you to carry a firearm in the parking lot, I would suggest that you attend more often, maybe get on the board of trustees and change the rules. And everyone is welcome to do that. But I do think it's wrong for us to make a law telling religious organizations what they can or can't do. Now, we passed a law earlier in the session called the Pastor Protection Act, and if this language from this amendment looks familiar, because that's where it came from. So if we're saying we should respect the religious organization in regards to performing a wedding ceremony, and that they cannot be forced to perform a wedding ceremony that goes against their sincerely held religious beliefs, which they couldn't do before or after we passed the law, because we can't infringe upon their religious rights. Well, I also don't think we should be forcing their hand when it comes to what people can and can't bring on their property. So I would urge adoption of this amendment.
Roll call has been demanded. Is demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Those in favor of the gentleman's amendment will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. Clerk, prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 14 ayes, 84 nays, 2 members absent not voting, less than the majority of members present having voted in the affirmative, I declare the amendment rejected. Are there further amendments?
Delegate Pushkin moves to amend the bill. This is HFA Pushkin 2-26, number 2.
John from the 37th, Delegate Pushkin asking our assent to explain the amendment in lieu of having it read. Is there objection? Chair hears none. John from 37th.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The way this bill is written right now, an employer does not have the right to ask an employee if they have a gun in their car. And what the amendment does, it strikes that language, and it says the employer can ask if an employee has a gun in the car, and I reserve the right to close.
Are there other members desiring to speak to the adoption of the amendment? John from the 15th, Doug Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would be opposed to this amendment. This is one that was made also in judiciary, and the reason for rejecting this is it erodes away the protections for the lawful gun owner that were put in this bill. And also, there was an amendment made to help the bill in judiciary that was, if you look in sub C of the same section, there's unlawful actions involving firearm made in violation of 61-624 of this code. And that was pretty much what that entails is if somebody is making a threat or act of violence under this section, then they're not protected by any of this code. So I would urge rejection of the gentleman's amendment.
John from 24th, Doug Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I'm going to rise in rejection of the gentleman's amendment. It's real simple. What's in my pocket's in my pocket. What's in my car is in my car. That's mine. It's none of your business. It's not the company's business. It's my business. And, Mr. Speaker, I will ask for the yeas and nays.
Are there other members desiring to speak to the adoption of the amendment before I recognize the gentleman from 37th? Lady from 51st, Doug Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, this amendment, or once again, people in this room are pitting the First Amendment and the right of private property to do what you want on your private property against the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment does not apply to private property, and on your own property, you are allowed to ask people questions about what they're doing. And if you support the First Amendment and you don't think it supersedes, and you don't think the Second Amendment supersedes everything else in the Constitution, you should support this amendment.
John from 63rd, Doug Folk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You pay property taxes on your vehicle. Personal property taxes, but they are taxes. And to say that you want employers to ask employees, if this law passes, whether they have a gun in the car or not, as you well know, we've already heard that the Manufacturers Association and probably some employers are obviously against this. That puts an at-will employee in a hard position. That's why we should reject this amendment, because if you have an employer that didn't want them to have their firearm in their personal private property, and they ask, even though it's in the law, everybody's known employers that if they don't like an employee or the fact that they don't like an employee that has a gun in their car, they can find some way to get rid of them. And this would make it even easier to do, so reject the amendment.
Lady from the 49th, Doug Summers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the gentleman yield?
The responser. Gentleman
The
yield.
sponsor, yes, thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mm-hmm.
I just had a question. We want the employer to be able to ask if they have a gun. Do we also want the employer to be able to ask if you have a bottle of opioid pills in your car, or do you have medical marijuana in your car? How much further do we think the employer should be able to ask the person the contents of their car?
Well, if it's their parking lot, I believe they can ask them what's in their car.
So you do think they should be able to ask all those questions if it's their parking lot?
Yeah, well, we passed a law last year that allows them to drug test anybody without a probable cause. So I believe they could already do that.
Okay, so we're fine with asking people other contents of their car. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Other members desiring to speak before I recognize the gentleman from 37th to close. Gentleman from 37th to close debate on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. I'll try to keep it short. I don't know of any laws that do prohibit an employer from asking the contents of a car, especially if it's parked on the employer's property. The gentleman from the 24th said, it's in my pocket, you can't ask me about it. Well, the employer could also say, well, that's my parking lot, and I can ask you about it. Someone brought up whether or not they pay taxes on your car. Well, I believe they also pay property taxes on their parking lot. I can think of no other object that we would pass a law saying you can't ask if it's in your car. You could ask if they have a garage door opener. You could ask if they have a CD player, but we can't ask if this passes. You wouldn't be able to ask if they have a firearm. And the reason that I've aside from the speech issue, I'm just in my mind I'm seeing a scenario like, say, employee A and employee B have a conflict. Maybe no threats are made, but it gets a little bit heated. So, and maybe you ask employee A, hey, you're going to need to go home for a while and cool down, but you can't ask, if they have a weapon in their car. I'm trying to look out for public safety and also for free speech, because I can think of no other places except when it comes to protected class under the Human Rights Act that an employer couldn't ask an employee a question like that. So, I urge adoption of the amendment.
Roll call has been demanded. Is the demand sustained? Demand is sustained. Those in favor of the gentleman's amendment will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On this question, 5 ayes, 93 nays, 2 members absent not voting. Less than the majority of members present having voted in the affirmative, I declare the amendment rejected. Are there further amendments?
Delegate Hanshaw moves to amend the bill. This is HFA Hanshaw 2-26, number 1.
The gentleman from 33rd, Delegate Hanshaw, asks unanimous consent to explain the amendment in lieu of having it read. Is there objection? Chair hears none. Gentleman from 33rd.
It's a technical correction, Mr. Speaker. It corrects an incorrect cross-reference in the bill. Thank you.
Other members desiring to speak to the adoption of the amendment. Gentleman from 60. If not, the question for the House is the adoption of the amendment. All in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Declare the amendment adopted. Are there further amendments? Not the bill be engrossed and advanced to third reading.